The last verified sighting came from a grainy receipt printed at a roadside fuel station so remote it didn't even appear on most digital maps. The ink was faint, the paper curled at the edges, and for 4 years it sat unnoticed in a rusted filing cabinet, until it quietly rewrote everything investigators thought they knew. The family arrived in Alaska without drama, without secrecy, and without any indication that they would never leave together. If you're new here, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our true crime mysteries. Now let's go back to how all of this started. Rowan Hale was 32, soft-spoken, methodical, and the kind of man who planned camping trips down to the ounce of food packed. His wife, Lila Hale, 28, was practical but warm, someone who kept journals, labeled family photos, and believed that routine made memories safer. Their daughter, 8-year-old Mira, was curious in the way children often are when they trust the world completely. She loved insects. She loved counting things. She loved asking questions that didn't always have answers. They lived in Oregon, where Rowan worked freelance logistics contracts and Lila did remote bookkeeping. Alaska, for them, wasn't an escape, it was a promise. A 2-week camping trip through Denali's outer wilderness, far from crowded trails, far from screens, far from noise. Rowan had mapped the route himself, choosing lesser-known camping zones approved by park authorities but rarely used. They told friends they wanted quiet that actually feels quiet. On paper, the trip was responsible. Permits were filed. Emergency check-in dates were registered. Equipment lists were complete. Rowan even left a printed itinerary with Lila's sister, detailing rough coordinates and estimated travel days. The Hales crossed into Alaska on a gray morning that smelled like wet stone and cold pine. Surveillance cameras captured them once more, smiling, tired, and ordinary, outside a general store just south of the Denali region. Mira held a paper bag with candy inside. Lila adjusted her jacket. Rowan checked the fuel gauge. After that, they vanished. At first, no one panicked. The family had planned to be unreachable for days at a time. Satellite check-ins were scheduled, but weather interference wasn't unusual. When the first check-in passed without contact, Park Services logged it as a delay. When the second passed, it became a concern. By the 5th missed contact, it became an operation. Search teams deployed on foot and by air, starting from the last known trailhead. Rangers scanned riverbanks, ravines, and known wildlife corridors. Helicopters hovered over stretches of forest so dense that even light struggled to reach the ground. Dogs followed scent trails that ended abruptly, too abruptly, near a ridge where the terrain changed from packed earth to spongy undergrowth. The campsite, when found, raised more questions than answers. The tent was intact. Supplies were organized. Food bins showed no signs of animal interference. Rowan's boots were placed side by side outside the tent, as if removed calmly. Lila's journal lay inside, open to a page filled the night before. The last sentence trailed off mid-thought. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no scattered belongings. Myra's small backpack was missing. Searchers expanded outward, assuming the family may have attempted to relocate due to weather or wildlife. But there were no tracks leading away. No broken branches. No disturbed soil. It was as if the forest had closed behind them. Weeks turned into months. By winter, the case was classified as a presumed fatal disappearance due to environmental exposure. Officially, the wilderness had taken them. Unofficially, no one involved in the search fully believed that explanation. Because Alaska is unforgiving, but it leaves evidence. Years passed. The Hale case faded from headlines, then from memory. Rowan and Lila were declared deceased in absentia. Myra's name appeared only occasionally, usually in quiet discussions about missing children whose cases had gone cold too quickly. Then, 4 years later, the forest spoke again. It began with a wildlife survey. A state-funded ecological team was conducting population tracking several miles beyond the original search radius. The area was considered low risk, far from campsites, deep within terrain known for unusually large ant colonies. Massive, layered anthills dotted the forest floor like hardened mounds of earth, some standing taller than a person's waist. One of the researchers noticed something unusual while measuring colony density. A section of one mound had collapsed inward, revealing a hollow beneath the surface. Ant activity around the opening was frantic, disorganized, unlike normal behavior. When the researcher crouched closer, he saw something pale through the dirt. It wasn't bone, at least not at first glance. It was too smooth. Authorities were notified. The site was sealed. Excavation began carefully, layer by layer, while forensic teams documented every movement. The ants had built over something, incorporating it into the structure of the mound itself. When the object was finally uncovered, no one spoke for a long time. It was a child's skull. Small, weathered, hollowed by time. Dental records confirmed the identity within days. Mira Hale. The distance between the anthill and the original campsite was nearly 12 miles. And there were no remains of her parents. No clothing. No personal effects. No trail connecting the two locations. Just a skull, buried beneath years of insect labor. The discovery shattered the original narrative. Exposure alone no longer explained anything. A child did not wander 12 miles through hostile terrain without leaving evidence. And she did not end up beneath a massive anthill by accident. The case was reopened immediately. Old evidence was pulled from storage. Search maps were re-examined. Witness statements were reread with new urgency. And tucked inside a forgotten box of receipts and ranger logs, an overlooked detail resurfaced. A fuel station receipt. Printed 4 years earlier. Time-stamped nearly 36 hours after the family was last officially seen. And it wasn't from the Hale vehicle. It was paid for in cash. And the attendant remembered something that had never been written down. Something involving a man who wasn't supposed to be there. And that was when investigators realized the Hales may not have vanished into the wilderness at all. The fuel station sat alone along a stretch of road that felt forgotten even by Alaska standards. No fast food signs. No neon lights. Just 2 aging pumps, a small convenience counter, and a man who had worked there long enough to recognize when something didn't belong. His name was Walter Kincaid, and 4 years earlier, on a slow afternoon wrapped in low fog, he'd processed a cash payment that never sat right with him. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. The receipt, now the quiet hinge of the entire case, was time-stamped at 6:41 p.m., 36 hours after the Hale family had officially gone missing. The fuel was purchased for a mid-sized utility vehicle, not the Hale's registered SUV. The amount suggested a partial refill, not a long-distance traveler. And the attendant remembered the man clearly because he'd asked an odd question. "Anyone camping out your way lately?" Walter had shrugged, told him people passed through all the time. The man had nodded, thanked him, paid in cash, and driven north, toward the forest. At the time, Walter thought nothing of it. People were strange up there. People asked strange things. But now, 4 years later, as investigators sat across from him with photos of the Hale family spread across the counter, Walter's stomach turned cold. Because he remembered something else. There had been a child in the vehicle. Not in the front seat. In the back. Quiet. Too quiet. Walter described her as small, dark-haired, her face turned toward the window. He couldn't see her clearly, but he remembered thinking she looked exhausted, pale, and there was something wrong with the way she held her head, tilted slightly, unnaturally still. The man driving had answered all questions politely. Too politely. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look nervous. He looked finished. Investigators returned to the Anthill site with new eyes. The mound wasn't random. It wasn't one of many clustered together. It stood alone, unusually large even by local standards, nearly 5 feet tall and hardened by years of ant-secreted binding agents. Entomologists explained that for an anthill to grow that size in that location, the colony would have needed an uninterrupted environment for several years. No disturbances. No predators. No excavation. Which meant Myra's remains had been there for a long time. Possibly from the beginning. Forensic analysis of the skull revealed no obvious fractures, no gunshot damage, no blunt force trauma. But there were subtle marks along the lower edge, consistent with prolonged exposure, but also with post-mortem insect activity. What it didn't show was just as important. There were no signs she had died from exposure. No microfractures consistent with freezing. No cracking typically seen in remains subjected to extreme cold immediately after death. Instead, the evidence suggested she had been sheltered for some time before she died. Or after. The implication was unbearable. If Mira had been alive when she left the campsite, then someone had taken her. Which meant someone had been close enough to take all three. Search teams had initially dismissed foul play because there was no sign of forced entry, no broken gear, no chaos. But seasoned investigators now questioned that assumption. Because not all abductions are violent. Some are quiet. Some happen when trust is misplaced. They re-examined Lila's journal. Between notes about weather conditions and Myra's fascination with beetles, there was a short entry written the night before the disappearance. One sentence, lightly underlined. Rowan spoke to someone near the creek today. Said he was camping farther north. At the time, rangers assumed it was another hiker. Now, it became the most important sentence in the case. No other campers had been registered in that area. No permits. No recorded sightings. But Alaska's wilderness is vast, and not everyone follows rules. Investigators reconstructed a timeline. Day 1, the Hales arrive at their campsite. Day 2, Rowan encounters an unidentified man near a water source. Day 3, no check-in. Somewhere within that window, something changed. Search dogs had lost the family's scent near the ridge. At the time, it was chalked up to wind interference. But a second analysis revealed something different. The scent didn't fade. It stopped. As if the family had entered a vehicle. The possibility rewrote the terrain. Investigators canvassed old road footage, trail cameras, and logging access points that had previously been ignored. Most footage had been overwritten or lost. But one camera, installed by a private conservation group, still held archived data. On the third night after the Hales vanished, at 2:13 a.m., a vehicle passed through an access road rarely used after dark. The footage was poor, but the vehicle was the same size as the one described by Walter. And in the back seat, barely visible through glare and shadow, was a small, unmoving shape. Public interest exploded when the case was reopened. True crime forums lit up with theories. Some believed the parents had been killed immediately and Mira abducted. Others suggested the entire family had been coerced into traveling with someone they thought they could trust. Then came the hardest truth. There was no evidence of a struggle because there may not have been one. The campsite showed calm. Order. Compliance. Which meant whoever approached them didn't appear threatening, at least not at first. Investigators explored every angle: survivalists, off-grid dwellers, unregistered hunters. A list of possible suspects emerged, but none fit completely. The man at the fuel station had never been identified. No fingerprints. No license plate. Cash payment. A ghost. Meanwhile, forensic entomologists made a discovery that chilled even seasoned professionals. The ants that built the mound over Myra's remains belonged to multiple generations of colonies. The earliest layers suggested the body had been placed deliberately, partially buried, long before the mound reached its size. Which meant someone had chosen that location. Someone who knew the land well enough to know ants would finish the job. Someone patient. And someone confident the remains would never be found. But they were. And now, for the first time in 4 years, investigators asked the question they should have asked from the beginning. If Mira ended up beneath the anthill, where were Rowan and Lila? Because if they were never found, it wasn't because the wilderness took them. It was because someone made sure they disappeared completely, and buried the smallest truth where no one thought to look. And just as investigators began narrowing in on a possible hunting cabin deep beyond the original search zone, a discovery inside an old ranger logbook threatened to upend the entire timeline. The ranger logbook wasn't hidden. That was the unsettling part. It had been sitting on a metal shelf inside a decommissioned ranger outpost less than 6 miles from where Myra's skull was found. The structure itself was long abandoned, its windows boarded, its radio equipment stripped years earlier when the park boundaries were redrawn. During the initial search 4 years ago, teams had passed it by, assuming it had already been cleared. It hadn't. The logbook covered a single summer season, the same year the Hale family vanished. Most entries were routine: weather conditions, wildlife sightings, maintenance notes. But near the end, written in a different hand, was an entry that made investigators freeze. Unscheduled contact near North Creek access. Family unit observed with unidentified male. No permits presented. Interaction appeared voluntary. There was no follow-up note. No incident report. No explanation for why the contact hadn't been escalated. The ranger who'd written it had retired shortly after that season. When investigators tracked him down, he was hesitant, uneasy, like someone being asked to remember something he'd tried very hard to forget. He said he remembered the encounter vaguely. A man had approached him along the trail, calm and articulate, claiming to be helping a family relocate their camp. He said they'd encountered bear activity and needed safer ground. The ranger hadn't verified permits because the interaction felt normal. The family had been there. Together. The ranger remembered the child. She'd been holding something in her hands, something small and moving. Ants. Mira had been fascinated, letting them crawl over her fingers. The image haunted everyone in the room. Investigators returned to the site of the ranger's encounter. The area sat between the campsite and the Anthill location, a midpoint no one had previously focused on. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed, not because they expected to find remains, but because they needed to understand the terrain. They found disturbed earth. Not deep, not wide, but deliberate. A shallow excavation site, long reclaimed by moss and plant growth. No bones were recovered. No clothing. Nothing conclusive. Except for one thing. A fragment of synthetic fabric, tangled in roots. Forensic testing confirmed it matched Lila Hale's outer jacket, down to a unique fiber blend from a discontinued manufacturer. Lila had been there. And she hadn't left. The theory began to form. The unidentified man didn't attack the family immediately. He inserted himself slowly, calmly. He offered help, knowledge, authority. Enough to make Rowan trust him, enough to make Lila not object, enough to keep Mira quiet. The wilderness wasn't the weapon. It was the cover. Investigators consulted behavioral analysts who specialized in isolated environment crimes. The profile that emerged was deeply unsettling. The suspect was likely local or semi-local. Someone comfortable in the terrain, capable of surviving long periods off-grid. Someone who understood how quickly evidence vanished in that environment. And someone who preferred control over chaos. The absence of violence at the campsite suggested coercion, not force. The lack of remains for the parents suggested intentional disposal, possibly in separate locations, possibly using natural features like rivers, crevasses, or animal corridors. Myra's placement beneath the anthill stood apart. She wasn't disposed of. She was placed. Carefully. The entomologist suggested that the body had been positioned to encourage ant activity, warm, sheltered, near an established colony. Over time, the ants would do what ants do: dismantle, transport, and build. It was a slow erasure. And it worked. Until it didn't. As media attention grew, tips poured in. Most were useless. Some were disturbing. A few were credible enough to chase. One tip came from a former bush pilot who claimed he'd transported a man matching the suspect's description several times during the years following the disappearance. The man paid in cash, never gave a full name, and requested drop-offs far from established settlements. Once, the pilot said, the man had been accompanied by a woman. Thin, silent, eyes downcast. The timeline didn't align perfectly, but investigators couldn't ignore it. They revisited Myra's skull, this time with fresh purpose. New forensic imaging revealed faint scoring near the base, not trauma, but restraint marks. Possibly from fabric. Possibly from prolonged pressure. She hadn't wandered off. She'd been held. The most chilling realization came next. Mira may not have died immediately. Environmental indicators suggested she had survived for days, possibly weeks, after leaving the campsite. Which meant she'd been alive long enough to remember. Alive long enough to be afraid. Alive long enough for someone to decide what to do with her. The case team faced an impossible question. Why leave her there? Why not dispose of her like the others? The answer, though unprovable, felt clear to those closest to the investigation. Because she was small. Because she was quiet. Because she was easy to move. And because, in the end, the man who took them believed the forest would protect his secret. The reopened investigation narrowed its focus to a cluster of off-grid structures beyond the ranger outpost, cabins built before modern permitting, some long abandoned, some not. One cabin stood out. It had no official owner, no recent utility records, but satellite imagery showed consistent heat signatures during the years following the disappearance. And beneath its floor, ground scans detected anomalies. The search warrant was approved within hours. As officers prepared to enter the cabin for the first time in decades, one investigator voiced what everyone was thinking. If Mira was found beneath the ants, then whatever happened to Rowan and Lila was buried much deeper. And inside that cabin, waiting beneath rotted floorboards, lay evidence that would finally confirm the family never left the wilderness on their own. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing that didn't belong there. Trees in Alaska grow with purpose, dense, crowded, defensive. But around the structure, the forest thinned unnaturally, as if pushed back over time. Moss crept up the walls. The roof sagged but hadn't collapsed. Whoever had used the cabin hadn't abandoned it in a hurry. They had left it slowly. Methodically, the first officers entered just after dawn. The air inside was stale, trapped, layered with years of smoke residue and damp wood. No furniture remained, but the outline of life was everywhere. Hooks on walls, nails driven with intent, a fire pit rebuilt more than once. And beneath the floorboards, exactly where ground scans had suggested, they found signs of disturbance. The boards were pried up carefully, not broken. Below them, the soil was darker than the surrounding earth, compacted and uneven. Digging began by hand. What they uncovered wasn't a body. It was worse. They found fragments of personal effects, items that should never be separated from the people who owned them. A bent wedding ring. A metal zipper pulled from a jacket matching Lila's missing outerwear. A cracked digital watch, water-damaged beyond function, still set to the time zone of Oregon. Rowan Hale's watch. There were no bones. No remains. Which meant one thing. Whatever happened to Rowan and Lila didn't end there. The cabin wasn't a burial site. It was a stop. Forensic teams spent days combing every inch of the structure. Hidden beneath a loose plank in the wall, they found something investigators hadn't expected at all. A child's drawing. Faded. Crude. But unmistakable. 3 stick figures stood side by side. One taller than the others. Another slightly smaller. The third, much smaller still, had lines drawn around its head. Hair. Above them, a fourth figure loomed, long arms, no facial features. And above that, written in uneven lettering, were 3 words. He said quiet. Handwriting analysis confirmed it wasn't Lila's. It wasn't Rowan's. It was Myra's. The realization hit the investigation like a physical blow. Myra had been alive inside that cabin. Alive long enough to draw. Alive long enough to understand fear. Alive long enough to obey. Investigators believed the family had been separated there. Rowan and Lila taken elsewhere, possibly killed soon after, possibly transported far beyond the search radius. The absence of remains suggested deliberate dispersal, using terrain that ensured nothing would ever surface. Rivers, crevasses, glacial runoff, places where the land erases people completely. Myra, however, had been kept. Why? No one could answer that definitively. Some believed the suspect couldn't bring himself to kill her immediately. Others believed she was leverage, used to control the parents. A few investigators believed something even darker, that Myra was seen not as a threat, but as something to be managed later. Whatever the reason, she survived longer than anyone ever knew. The Anthill placement now made horrifying sense. She wasn't dumped. She was returned to the land. Carefully. Quietly. In a place where the forest would finish what the man could not, or would not, do himself. The final forensic conclusion was brief but devastating. Cause of death. Undetermined. Manner of death. Homicide. The report stated that environmental exposure alone could not account for the evidence. Human involvement was certain. The only uncertainty was the identity of the person responsible. And that uncertainty remains. The cabin yielded no fingerprints. No DNA profiles matched existing databases. The drawing offered no facial detail. The fuel station attendant's description remained vague. The ranger's memory, though sincere, lacked specifics. The man had moved through the wilderness like a shadow. Locals were interviewed again: hunters, trappers, seasonal workers, off-grid residents. Several names surfaced, but none could be substantiated. Some suspects had died. Others vanished themselves. A few lived on, ordinary and unremarkable, impossible to pin down. The case stalled again. But it never closed. Mira Hale was laid to rest 4 years after she disappeared. Her parents' names were added beside hers, though no remains were recovered. The grave marker reads all 3 names, united at last in stone. Search teams still patrol the region occasionally, not officially, not publicly. Rangers say it's routine. Locals know better, because the wilderness remembers. And sometimes, when hikers pass near that massive anthill, now collapsed and reclaimed by Earth, they report something unsettling. A quiet feeling. The sense of being watched. Of standing where someone once stood very still, listening, waiting for the forest to do the rest. The Hale family didn't vanish because Alaska is dangerous. They vanished because someone used the wilderness as a weapon. And to this day, no one knows who he was, or where he went. Only that he walked away, and the forest covered his tracks.